All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Circus seminar this week. My name is Kai Wen. It's my greatest honor to invite our speaker today, Dr. Nithya Sambasivan, to talk about her work on the myopia of modern centrisms. Dr. Sambasivan is a social technical researcher whose work is in solving hard socially important design problems impacting marginalized community in the global south. Her current research reimagines AI fundamentals to work with low resource communities. As a former staff research scientist at Google Research, she pioneered several original award-winning research initiatives such as responsible AI in the global south, human data interaction, gender equity online, and also next billion users, which fundamentally shape the company's strategy for emerging markets, besides landing as new products affecting millions of users, including in Google Stations, Search, YouTube, Android, Maps, and more. Dr. Sambasivan founded and managed a Blueprint HCI team in Google Research, Bangalore, and set up the Aqua HCI team in context with limited existing HCI pipelines. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Sambasivan again. And let me hand it over to her.
Thank you, Kai, Hyla, Milind, and all the organizers of the symposium for having me here at the seminar. So my talk today is on the myopia of model centrism. I estimate to speak for about 40-45 minutes, so I appreciate any clarification questions during the talk, and if there are any big questions, to hold off until the end for the Q&A. So in this talk, I present my research insights and ask a few fundamental questions of how AI is developed and impacts the humans involved, particularly the most vulnerable communities. And I start with these words from Jiddu Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher. What is important is to put forth a fundamental question and not to find an answer. And if we're capable of looking at the fundamental question without seeking an answer, then the very observation of the fundamental brings about understanding. So throughout this talk, I hope to leave you with several open-ended questions for which there may not be immediate answers, but will hopefully spur some thought on how AI can be productively used for deployed and designed for vulnerable communities. So many scholars argue that AI research and practice today places novel model development, which is the mathematical algorithms that power AI and machine learning, at the center. New model architectures and bigger and better state-of-the-art performances are celebrated in the field. Criticism has been raised about how the overt emphasis on models has reached a point of ridicule, with some calling it alchemy, empirical challenges be won, incremental, and leaderboards. While the AI and machine learning communities lionize models, dataset work is rejected in leading conferences until very recently, illustrating to us what is considered science and what is not, what is valued and what is not. AI models are also reported to be measured against clean and large datasets without noise in order to report high performances. But the real world is dynamic. Early progress in AI, which is the low-hanging fruit of quantity alone, no longer applies to harder subjective problems and edge cases like cancer predictions. So AI is increasingly applied to high-stakes domains with critical safety impacts on living beings. And by living beings, I don't just mean human beings, I also mean wildlife, plant life, the environment. Several of these high-stakes AI projects seek to intervene in low-resource contexts, in fragile and complex domains. For example, from our research with several AI researchers and practitioners, and developers, a sample vision statement from one of the participants was to diagnose tuberculosis from X-rays in 15 seconds instead of the baseline of 10 days. and in regions with 1 doctor per 30,000 people. Now, several high-stakes AI projects are also high modernist, like this one above, demonstrating strong confidence in the potential for scientific and technological progress as a means to reorder the natural world. It is against this backdrop where I situate my research. Resource constraints make certain aspects legible. Several humans are enrolled in service of the machine in these contexts in the form of domain experts, annotators, field partners, and even users. The downstream impacts of these projects, regardless of success or failure, can be huge on the communities. Specifically, I have been interested in answering the questions of how is the machine made? What does the process include or exclude? What are the practices of AI developers in building systems in high-stakes areas? How are the crucial non-model aspects like data and labor seen by developers in system development? How are the various human contributors perceived and engaged with by the AI practitioners? And what do practitioner practices tell us about whether AI is even a good fit for high-stakes areas? So in order to answer these questions, I have been studying up AI researchers and developers building cutting-edge, high-stakes AI systems in low-resource areas. Now, studying up is a technique from anthropology of observing the practices of professionals and also quite literally here moving up the ML pipeline. So in today's talk, I'm going to report from a couple of projects, a qualitative study with AI researchers in the US, India, and various sub-Saharan African countries, as well as a study with scholars and activists working on social justice in India on their concerns about responsible AI. My vantage point is that of a socio-technical researcher with a background in human-computer interaction and ICT for D, having worked with marginalized communities in the global south to build technologies for the past 15 years. I discuss both the technical aspects of how the systems are made, as well as the socio-political aspects of how the humans are involved and impacted by these systems in the global south. So I'm breaking up the talk into 4 parts, starting with data cascades, moving to a recent paper on de-skilling of domain expertise, followed by reimagining algorithmic fairness, and ending with some implications for practical application and design and future work. So starting with data cascades in AI, this is a paper from CHI 2021 in collaboration with several Google researchers. This was awarded a Best of CHI. Data is the critical infrastructure that's necessary to build artificial intelligence systems. Data largely determines performance, fairness, robustness, safety, and scalability of AI systems. Paradoxically, for AI researchers and developers, data work is often the least incentivized aspect. It is viewed as operational relative to the glamorous work of building models. Data is often viewed as a databases, legal, or licensing issue, but we believe that human-computer interaction, or HCI, has an important role to play in elevating data as a first-class citizen of data and data work as a first-class citizen of AI systems. So in our research, we observe and define data cascades as compounding events causing negative downstream impacts from data issues that result in technical debt over time. In our study, which is to connect the dots, this was a study that was done with high-stakes AI practitioners in various countries around the world. 92% of our participants reported experiencing at least one data cascade, and 45% reported experiencing 2 or more data cascades. Data cascades are complex, long-term. They occur frequently and persistently. They are opaque in their diagnosis and manifestation, with no clear indicators, tools, or metrics to detect and measure their effects. In fact, a number of AI practitioners use system-level metrics like F1 score rather than, or in addition to using data-level metrics to understand the quality and the fairness of the data set. and system level metrics, of course, do not tell us everything about or pretty much anything about the quality of the data itself. They are triggered when conventional AI practices are applied in high stakes domains, like viewing data as operations, moving fast to a proof of concept, hacking model performance without consideration for data quality, or undervaluing domain expertise and labor. Data cascades have negative impacts on the AI development process, including harm to beneficiary communities, burnout of relationships, discarding entire data sets, and performing costly iterations. Cascades, though, are often avoidable by stepwise and early interventions in the development process. So we observe 4 types of data cascades, which are discussed in the paper. I will discuss 2 here for brevity. Starting with interacting with physical world brittleness. High-stakes AI systems are typically brittle. They interact with previously undigitized environments like air quality sensing, ocean sensing, or ultrasound scanning, leading to even more reasons for an AI model to break, like limited training data, complex underlying phenomena, volatile domains, and changes to regulations. Data cascades here can appear in the form of hardware, environmental, and human knowledge drifts. As an example, even the slightest movement of a traffic camera due to wind can result in failures of the model in detecting traffic patterns, including major violations like accidents and other important highway incidents. Artifacts like fingerprints, shadows, dust on the lens, improper lighting, and pen markings were reported to affect model predictions. Rain and wind can move image and other sensors in the wild, leading to incorrect model results. A conventional AI practice of training on pristine data, but deployed in the messy real world, appear to trigger these cascades. Data cascades of this type took the longest to manifest, taking up to 2 to 3 years to emerge, and almost always in production, in deployment, and when live with the vulnerable communities. Another type of cascade comes from poor cross-organizational documentation, which is set off by a lack of documentation across various relations within the organization, with field partner organizations and data collectors, and external sources. So practitioners here describe several instances where collected and inherited data lacks critical details, and the missing metadata leads practitioners to make assumptions, often faulty assumptions, ultimately leading to costly discarding or recollecting data or harm to communities. For example, a lack of metadata and collaborators changing schema led to 4 months of precious medical robotics data collection in one case. As high-stakes data tends to be niche and specific, with varying underlying standards and conventions in data collection, even minute changes can render data sets unusable. A conventional AI practice of neglecting the value of data documentation and field partners not being made aware of constraints in achieving good quality AI appears to set off these cascades. And this will be the focus of my next talk, the next part of my talk. Cascades of this type became visible only through manual reviews, often by chance. The impacts of these cascades include wasted time and effort from using incorrect data, being blocked on building models, and discarding entire subsets or data sets. So our results indicate the sobering prevalence of messy, protracted, and opaque data cascades, troublingly in high-stakes domains. Data cascades point to the contours of a larger problem: residual conventions and perceptions in AI and machine learning that are drawn from the worlds of big data, of abundant digital resources, of model valorization, of moving fast to proof of concept, and of viewing data as grunt work in the ML workflow. We need to move towards a proactive focus on the practices, politics, and values of humans of the data pipeline. We need to move from the current approach of goodness of fit to a model to also including goodness of data, from doing more and collecting more data to doing better with the data that we have. We need to innovate on structural incentives to recognize and reward data work in conference tracks through organizational recognition of data glue work, through greater collaboration and transparency with data collectors and shared benefits for both the AI practitioners and field partners. Data ethics and practical data work, oversight boards like the IRB, and ethics standards should be a part and parcel of AI education and praxis, given where the field seeks to intervene. Finally, we need greater data equity in the global south. Now, a study was conducted across multiple countries around the world, but we see that there is sufficient access to open and pre-trained models and even AI and ML education, but it is with data and compute where we see the greatest disparities between developers building for high resource and low resource contexts. So this work led to a bunch of impact. It led to the rewriting of the data chapter in the PAIR guidebook with a state-of-the-art set of guidelines on working with data in the AI ML pipeline. NeurIPS introduced a data set track for the first time. It's a recommendation we make in the paper calling for larger structural changes in AI. And the work has also opened up a research agenda on creating interfaces, processes, and policy for data excellence in AI, and has been implemented in 10 Google products. Now I'm moving to the second portion of my talk, the de-skilling of domain expertise in AI. This is in collaboration with Rajesh Veeraraghavan from Georgetown. Field workers are necessary for AI projects in areas with poor infrastructure where there are limited data sets available. This must be familiar to a number of you. It is standard procedure in building AI in low resource areas to partner with field organizations and their workers, like community health workers, agricultural extension workers, microfinance NGO workers, who play a crucial role in the bootstrapping as well as in the deployment of these models. The field workers are known to be underpaid and overworked. For example, an ASHA worker or a community health worker in India performs a mind-boggling array of 720 tasks, and AI data collection is often additional to their primary responsibilities. However, domain experts like the field worker are chronically undervalued in the history of AI. Here's an illustrative quote from NLP researcher Frederick Jelinek on the disregard for domain experts in building language models. Every time I fire a linguist, the performance of the speech recognizer goes up. Given that models seek to emulate and aggregate local expertise from field workers, to what extent is the worker's expertise acknowledged, engaged with, or credited by the AI developer in building the model? Our results show that despite the mastery and tacit knowledge of field workers that takes decades to build, and that which the AI model seeks to emulate, AI developers seem to reduce field workers to data collectors for their uber expert models. We find that most developers do not have any first-hand contact with, provide training, or compensate field workers for their data labor. Even in cases where compensation is possible. With the absence of direct interactions with field workers, in most cases, the work of a field worker was primarily read through their dataset artifacts. AI developers attributed poor data quality to poor work practices of field workers. Field workers were perceived to come in the way of the worthwhile model development efforts of developers. We present 4 conceptions of field workers as held by developers. And this is a paper that's coming out at CHI 2022 in a month. There's more detail on the findings in the paper. Field workers were perceived as corrupt, lazy, non-compliant, and as the data set itself, which is referred to as outcomes and outputs and not as human beings. Despite the limited engagement and first-hand understanding of field workers, developers reported creating several disciplinary interventions to influence field workers to collect better quality data in the form of surveillance, gamification, cross-verification, and pre-processing fixes. Now, to borrow from political anthropologist James Ferguson, data collection in AI operates as an anti-politics machine, making political decisions about what constitutes expertise and creating technical solutions to technical problems through these management interventions to influence workers to collect better quality data. We argue that the AI development apparatus in low resource areas tends to de-skill and invisibilize domain expertise in these contexts. Field workers should be accurately viewed as domain experts with special knowledge and mastery in their local context. Even though the models in our studies sought to emulate and improve over the expertise of the workers and their expertise itself was treated as non-essential knowledge by the practitioners. The workers' knowledge, networks, and capabilities were viewed as assets for dataset collection, rather than necessary expertise for system building. AI developers who are experts in their technical fields, but not in the application domains, for example, a developer building a cancer prediction model will inevitably leave gaps from a model that excludes domain expertise. The data quality issue that we report, which is actually a fairly common issue in low resource areas of having poor quality data when mediated through human data collection. But this framing of the data quality issue as coming from field workers fudging data or sabotaging data collection is only an issue if we think of domain experts in these limited ways. But if we were to reimagine domain expertise as an essential partnership throughout the AI pipeline, we can see new possibilities for collecting, modeling, and scaling knowledge. Domain experts can contribute to important critical questions that can impact model behaviors, like what exactly are we modeling? What assumptions are appropriate? What features should be included in the model? What are we trying to predict? And how will we know? We call for viewing domain experts as full-range experts in their communities, to find participatory ways to partner with domain experts in the ML lifecycle from the problem formulation stage to measuring impacts of systems. We need better recognition and attribution of domain experts' contributions. We discussed several of these ideas and some practical approaches in the discussion section of the paper. We argue that it's possible to interpret the perceptions of worker corruption and sabotage as acts of worker resistance to their exploitative conditions of work, modifying James C. Scott's memorable phrase, "These are the weapons of the data collector." Instead of motivating an overworked health worker to do more work for data set collection, one might ask how to help them achieve their goals better, how to prioritize their numerous visits, better capture of their in situ knowledge, allocate limited medical resources better, and build visibility into their contributions. Indeed, this is one way to realize the shared goals of both the AI developer and the domain expert on human development in low resource areas. Behavioral tricks for improving dataset collection, like gamification and surveillance, will only cause long-term damage and resentment among field workers. A crucial step in this direction is for AI developers to engage directly with with field workers instead of interfacing with organization heads or NGO heads and hearing secondhand narratives about workers. As Lucy Suchman points out, work has a tendency to disappear at a distance, such that the further removed we are from the work of others, the more simplified, often stereotyped, our view of their work becomes. So with that, I'm moving to the third part of my talk, which is a paper from FACT from last year on reimagining algorithmic fairness in India and beyond. This was done in collaboration with...
Nithya, yes. I think we had the questions from the audience. Neil, would you mind unmute yourself? We cannot hear you.
Neil, we have no audio from you.
If you could type your question.
Okay, while you are doing that, I'm moving to the third part of my talk and we'll get to the question at the end.
Sure.
Thank you. So this portion now focuses on, so we've talked about data work and labor, and now moving to responsible AI, which is one of the fundamental ways in which we implement and enforce ethics in AI systems. So this is another study that was done in collaboration with several Google researchers. Conventional algorithmic fairness makes several assumptions based on Western institutions and infrastructures. For example, a successful outcome from fairness research, which is bans on facial recognition, comes from a concerted effort across decades of scientific research in the West on Western populations, public data sets, APIs, and information acts for researchers to analyze model outcomes, an ML industry and research community that is fairly responsive to bias reports, government representatives that are glued into tech policy, and an active media that systematically scrutinizes AI impacts. We argue in the paper that the assumptions about the relevance and efficacy of these factors fail and can even be harmful in much of the world. Fairness research remains rooted in Western concerns and histories, the subgroups of race and gender, data sets like ImageNet and WordNet, and measurement scales like the Fitzpatrick scale, and legal tenets that are sometimes derived from civil law. However, conventional algorithmic fairness is being increasingly copy-pasted and espoused in AI policies in countries like India, Tunisia, Uruguay, Mexico, and more, without paying attention to local contexts. Now, without engagement with the conditions, values, politics, and histories of the non-West, algorithmic fairness can be at best a tokenism and pernicious at worst for the communities. If algorithmic fairness is to serve as the ethical compass of AI, and indeed this seems to be the algorithmic fairness seems to be the locus of all ethics-related conversations within AI and machine learning and other interdisciplinary fields. It is imperative that the field recognize its own defaults, biases, and blind spots to avoid exacerbating historical harms that it purports to mitigate. We must take pains not to develop a general theory of algorithmic fairness based on the study of Western populations alone. So in our paper, we asked, could fairness have structurally different meanings in the non-West? Could fairness frameworks that rely on Western infrastructures be counterproductive elsewhere? How do social, economic, and infrastructural factors influence fair machine learning? We provide an analysis of end-to-end algorithmic power in India and provide a starting roadmap on algorithmic fairness when centered or decentered from the West and centered in India. So to answer these questions, we focus on India, the world's largest democracy, and that's increasingly on paper, a multi-ethnic, multilingual, post-colonial nation, and the world's second largest internet-using population. Despite several high-stakes AI deployments in areas like predictive policing and welfare disbursements, there is no substantial responsible AI research or tech policy currently in India. One of our key arguments is that the distance between models and disempowered communities in India, whom we hope to serve, is large because of technical distance, social distance, ethical distance, temporal distance, and physical distance. And so a myopic focus on simply localizing fair model outputs alone can backfire on the communities. Again, to connect the dots here, my focus throughout this talk is on the myopia of model centrism, and often algorithmic fairness is framed as a model issue, and that ensuring that fair and accurate model outputs for different subgroups is tantamount to the problem being over or the system being fair. But here I'm going to challenge how that doesn't work in a context like India. So we point to three themes that challenge existing assumptions in India, starting with data and model distortions. Biases in models are often attributed to biased data sets, and there's a notion of fixing the data to fix the bias. But data can often be missing in the form of digital divide, where half the country does not have access to the internet. The excluded half is primarily women, rural communities, and Adivasis, who are the indigenous tribes of South Asia. My prior body of work on gender equity online was motivated by how 2/3 of women of countries online have more men than women online. Sorry, let me rephrase that. 2/3 of countries worldwide have more men than women online. And in India, at the time of conducting the research, only 29% of internet users were women. Data can be missing due to class, gender, caste, and other inequities in creating and accessing online content. So that is, even when one has access to the internet, they may not have full participation online because of these various inequities. And as a result, any digital data is a representation of the privileged. Off-data practices are common in contexts like India, which happen outside of a network, say through phone calls, not counting as data. Data can also be missing due to artful user practices to manipulate algorithms that are motivated by privacy, abuse, and reputation concerns. Socioeconomic and demographic data sets at national, state, and municipal levels is frequently unavailable to the public, despite especially data sets that feature migration, incarceration, unemployment, or education by different subgroups. Now, this is an impediment to conducting meaningful fairness research. The image on the right is that of the contact tracing application that was introduced during COVID and was mandatorily enforced upon citizens of India. Now, again, you will see the flaws of introducing such an application when only half the country has access to the internet. Moving to proxies, which may be similar in the Indian context to that of the West, but may have different implementation nuances being pluralistic countries. For example, a name is the most semantically meaningful proxy, which can communicate caste, gender, religion, class, and ethnicity in India. Zip codes are often heterogeneous, unlike the West, which may have a history of redlining in some parts of the United States in particular, with slum housing and posh housing often abutting each other in the Indian context. Mobility has been reported to be much lower for women due to safety concerns and for people with disabilities due to limited infrastructure like ramps. Traditional occupations may correspond to caste or religion. Proxies may not even generalize within the country, like asset ownership. Owning a two-wheeler, a scooter, or a motorcycle in the city of Mumbai is radically different from owning the same vehicle in the rural parts of Maharashtra, which is the state in which Mumbai is located. AI systems in India, and this is an important point I wish to make, AI systems in India remain under-analyzed for biases, mirroring the limited public discourse on oppression. This is in contrast to, say, for example, the anti-racism discourse or discourse on indigenous communities in US and even EU media, which creates public pressure on the ML industry and the research community to account for, to measure, and to detect biases in these systems. But we find that this is lacking in the Indian context, where there is very limited public discourse on oppression, on topics like caste and even gender. In our paper, we introduce axes of discrimination that are specific to India, like caste, religion, gender identity, and more, which can be a starting point for fairness examinations for models that are deployed in the country. Moving to the second theme, that challenges inherent assumptions in algorithmic fairness. On the double standards of ML makers, Indian users are perceived as bottom billion data subjects and given poor recourse, effectively limiting their agency. Whereas industry and research is somewhat responsive to user bias reports in the West, recourse and agency of Indian users, especially those disempowered by caste, religion, or gender, is poorly addressed in AI systems. AI systems remove street-level bureaucrats, administrative officers, and frontline workers, like the field workers that I referenced in the previous portion, who are the human infrastructures that play a crucial role in providing recourse and access to marginalized Indian communities. The high-tech illegibility of AI systems renders recourse out of reach for groups that are marginalized by literacy, legal, or educational capital. Put simply, if a user in San Francisco were to report a complaint on or to publicly tweet about bias from a prominent AI model against them, there is a possibility of that complaint being registered or being acted upon, especially if they go through official channels. But this is kind of an impossibility for vulnerable communities in parts of India who are not even aware that there is an AI model that is acting upon them, let alone have channels to report and to seek recourse. Dalit and Muslim bodies, Dalits who are the most oppressed in the caste system in India, and Muslim bodies are used as test subjects for AI surveillance systems increasingly. For example, how human efficiency trackers, which you see the image on the right, are increasingly deployed among Dalit sanitation workers. And these are wearables that are equipped with microphones, GPS, cameras, and a SIM card that have been reported to lead to women workers avoiding restrooms for fear of camera capture or waiting for the tracker to die before going home. And finally, while Indians are part of the AI workforce, a majority work in low-level services like annotation, and the minority engineers often come from privileged class and caste backgrounds, which limits remediation of distances, particularly with the vulnerable communities. Moving to the final point on how algorithmic fairness is fundamentally needs to be rethought in the Indian context, unquestioning AI aspiration. AI is aspirational and readily adopted in high-stakes domains, often too early in India. For example, the facial recognition system used by the Delhi police has been known to have 2% accuracy and cannot distinguish between boy and girl children, as reported in the Supreme Court. And this system was used to arrest 1,100 protesters in January of last year. Now, for reference, a confidence threshold of 80 to 95% is recommended for law enforcement AI, and here we have 2%. The statement from the state was, this is a software. It does not see face, it does not see clothes, it only sees the face, and through the face, the person is caught. While algorithms may not be trained on subgroup identification, proxies may correspond to Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims disproportionately, in how under trials in prisons largely come from these communities and are often non-literate members. In contrast to the thriving focus in various fields like AI, machine learning, HCI, and many other related fields on interpretability, explainability, and transparency, we find that AI solutions in India have end-to-end opacity, especially those that are deployed in the public domain, with unknown data, model behavior, and unknown inferences. India lacks an effective ecosystem of tools, policies, and processes that help stakeholders to interrogate these solutions, which is a major impediment in ensuring meaningful algorithmic fairness. I want to cite an example here of a paper by Shivangi Narayan and Vidushi Marda, in fact, from one of the previous years, in the conference fact, on the data that is used in predictive policing in India, in New Delhi in particular, and their method of recording data for the paper was by hanging out at call centers and literally observing the data that goes into the data records. While that is the paper is excellent, and that's a very relevant method for the goals of the paper, this type of observational research is fundamentally unscalable and renders certain questions unsuitable along the ML pipeline. But in contrast, again, many of these techniques are available in Western context to be able to audit and scrutinize models. Finally, tech journalism in India appears to cover app launches and tech business deals, and do not scrutinize algorithms and their impacts. And again, this is in a bit of a contrast with how media outlets like The Guardian and ProPublica have been instrumental in creating public awareness and mounting pressure on ML makers in areas like facial recognition. And so here we have a big absence of that kind of public pressure. So fair ML strategy for India needs to reflect its deeply plural, complex, and contradictory nature. And returning to my previous point, low resource communities in India may not even be aware that there is an AI acting upon them, let alone a technical system behind their services. And hence, algorithmic fairness needs to go beyond simply model fairness alone. Due to the data and model distortions in India, we must combine data sets with an understanding of context. The vibrant human infrastructures point to new ways of looking at data as dialogue. We identify a set of axes of discrimination and fairness optimizations in India that could serve as a starting point to detect and mitigate unfairness issues in models in the paper. Marginalized communities need to be empowered in identifying problems, specifying fairness expectations, and designing systems to avoid top-down fairness. India's heterogeneity means that a fair ML researcher's commitment should go beyond model outputs to creating systems that are accessible to those communities. And here there's a lot to be learned from related computing fields like ICTD and AI for social good. Like the fatal Union Carbide gas leak in 1984, unequal standards, inadequate safeguards, and dubious applications of AI in the non-West can lead to catastrophic effects. For fair ML research to be impactful and sustainable, it is crucial for researchers to enable a critically conscious fair ML ecosystem through solidarity with policymakers, civil society, and journalists. Context matters. We must take care not to copy-paste the Western normative algorithmic fairness everywhere. Borrowing from Arturo Escobar, we must evolve pluriverses of AI ethics to flourish. With that, I'm moving to the implications in the interest of time. We empirically find that there is an enormous focus on model development among AI researchers and developers due to various incentives such as publication prestige, how residencies are evaluated, competitive differentiation, and so on. AI education is now significantly more accessible, but remains largely focused on model building, not addressing the real-world challenges of collecting data or deploying and measuring systems, which practitioners increasingly have to do. Some practitioners report hacking model performance to look good to funders, clients, and for conference papers, with less regard for underlying safety or quality of these systems. The overt focus on models often comes at the cost of ignoring important questions around the role of disempowered non-Western communities that are drafted into building or using these systems. And this is problematic as AI models are increasingly seeking to intervene in domains where governments, civil society, and policymakers have historically struggled. This view comes from the conventional AI/ML pipeline, which begins with an available, perhaps unclean data set and ends with model evaluation or deployment in a sanitized system, often in a laboratory setting. Now, it is clear that the scope of what is considered to be AI must evolve, keeping in step with where the field is actually going today. Metrics are currently defined by concerns of machine beats human efficiency, cost, and outperforming the state-of-the-art or the industry standard, which often relies on the expertise of AI developers, rather than appropriate metrics to evaluate claims that are relevant to the affected communities and phenomena as decided by domain experts and by communities as well. Non-model aspects like data, domain expertise, labor, meaningful safeguards for users are considered to be outside of the scope of AI, relegated to operations, whereas the elite status of AI system building is restricted to high priests of developers, leaders of partner organizations, celebrity scientists, and bureaucrats, and the machine intelligence itself. Data work is undervalued despite its importance in AI systems. Essential experts are largely automated, reduced, or punished for data collection in order to build uber expert models. The end of fairness offers a veneer of credibility, but when examined closely, these frameworks can be dangerously symbolic and possibly harmful to non-Western contexts in which they were not conceived in. More work is needed in all these areas. We need to move from model at the center to ecosystem thinking. While there has been much needed progress on including impact statements in papers and disclosing data annotation techniques and even introducing the NeurIPS datasets track, a lot more has to evolve to reflect the on-the-ground practices in AI as it stands today. Data work needs greater recognition and inclusion in the field. How expertise is defined, who is considered an expert, how expertise fed into models is acknowledged and credited are all important questions to answer. We press upon AI developers the need to embrace more participatory stances with humans involved, not control and punishment techniques. The unregulated surplus labor that comes from the global south poses new questions on who are the contributors to AI systems. There are long chains of humans that are involved in enabling model development in AI in low resource areas. How should attribution, transparency, provenance, and compensation evolve to include this surplus labor? Economic measurements of AI, such as the opening vision statement on detecting tuberculosis in 15 seconds instead of 10 days, measure the before and after effects of algorithms setting. However, they miss out on measuring how domain experts and workers were involved and drafted into hidden labor, whether and how experts and communities were displaced as a result of the model, and whether and how expertise was redistributed as a result of the model, especially in the long term. We need to expand the parameters of what gets measured and seen in AI systems in order to fully comprehend the effects of these systems. Ultimately, AI systems need to be seen as interventions over existing infrastructures, not as sanitized deployments. I want to end with this quote from David Attenborough, the renowned conservationist at COP26. Is this how our tale is to end? A tale of the smartest species doomed by that all-too-human characteristic of failing to see the bigger picture in pursuit of short-term goals, end quote. Whether it is climate change, industrial capitalism, or its modern offspring of AI systems, can we start to see the big picture before it's too late? That brings me to the end of the talk. I have a lot of people to thank and happy to answer any questions or hear any comments.
Right. Thank you for the amazing talk. And I would like to reserve one question from Neil. Neil, would you mind?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Sorry about the trouble. Hi, Nithya. Nice to see you again. I have a question about a couple of things. So first one, when you're talking about AI systems, what particular decisions these systems are making in the context that you have studied them? And then second related question is about data work. So in crowdsourcing, for instance, we extensively studied this data market like Amazon Mechanical Turk, where workers get paid like 1 cent or 2 cents or 3 cents per task, labeling the images for ImageNet and other data sources. So how is it different, looking at those workers and their conditions while creating like largest data sets like ImageNet versus a farmer or ASHA worker in India contributing to the data labor? Do you think like this is much bigger problem just rather than just collecting the data from the worker? Is it more of a power relation in the entire AI supply chain?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question. The point around data work being under-recognized has resonated enormously with AI practitioners, and ever since we put out this research, and there's also been other researchers that are published in this area increasingly. I think this is a larger structural problem. The specific instance of field workers and domain experts it's a very specific case, but there's a larger issue of data work being under-recognized and data quality not being seen as an important aspect beyond just model building. So, this is reflected in how data scientists are treated in the AI hierarchy, in how conferences treat certain, publications or submissions around data work and so on and so forth. Now, for the specific problem of field workers versus data annotators, so there's actually a bunch of research that our group has published, my former group has published on data annotation in its modern form of being in an outsourcing industry versus Mechanical Turk, which is more of a traditional format. So we also have other reference points to look at. My point is that field workers are drafted in largely in an informal and often invisibilized fashion. This in contrast to how workers are recruited on platforms like MTurk and other crowd work platforms, or even data annotation industries. And so you have a different set of regulations, policies, wage policies, and so on and so forth, but practically non-existent in this field that I'm talking about. So it's all made up as projects go. And so there's a number of different ways to collect and label data for projects in low resource areas, not just through field workers, but also through data annotation and so on, other formal mechanisms. There's been, I think, at least a decade of research on the unfair work conditions of platformized crowd work, but we're just about starting to see the nature of field workers and other sort of surplus laborers being included in AI systems, and introducing the challenges, and then hopefully we'll start to see some solutions in the space as well. So this is an emerging area of research. I hope that answers your question. They're architecturally very different.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Nithya, for a very thoughtful presentation. And one of the most salient points that I picked up was when you were recommending that AI researchers and AI practitioners work directly and interface directly with people on the ground and with the field workers, and not necessarily through the intermediate of an NGO. And I think that your point about the removal kind of leading to a kind of destructive habits. But one question that I have on that point is, how can we do that kind of work and have those kinds of interactions without being exploitative towards the people that we are interacting with? So without having like unjust labor and demands on their time, while making sure that we are kind of culturally sensitive. And these are all things that perhaps the NGO in question would be in some ways better positioned to help account for.
Yeah, that's a great question. There were a couple of examples of good practices from the research we conducted that I can start off with. It starts with building a. So first off, let me acknowledge that there is a problem of scalability, right? It's impossible to talk to all the field workers and understand the context across all the sites of deployment. But it is very much possible to establish a relationship with some field workers. And again, I want to point to the field of ICTD, which has where technology systems have been built in collaboration or in partnership with marginalized communities. And computer scientists have found ways to work with communities. So this is not new per se. The approach exists in the field. And again, I think, in a place like Harvard, with such a vibrant interdisciplinary ethos, there's a lot of possible synergy that can happen between AI and HCI in learning and understanding these observational techniques, in working with communities ethically and fairly, in providing attribution and acknowledgement, and preserving that relationship. There can be techniques such as simply going to the site of data work and observing field workers in their as they do their daily workflows, and observing what challenges they encounter, what are the steps that they follow. And this is really crucial because data collection is often introduced to their workflow. And if their workflow is not necessarily friendly to data collection, that must be understood by the AI researcher, right? And AI data often requires really low-level data points that are often mechanistic or time-based or extremely precise. And this may often be a challenge to field workers whose work tends to be a lot more relationship-based, or even when there is data collection, it may come out of building very strong rapport over decades, and the trust that comes from that. So it's really important to understand the current set of practices and challenges before introducing a new data collection or a data collection technique for AI. Other techniques that we've found to be really successful, which I would say are really fair as well, are creating transparency for the field workers. We've seen some cases where developers have gone to the field and talked about the goals of the system, the outputs of the system, and how it's intended to be deployed, and had conversations with field workers about the nature of these systems and solicited feedback. And that is enormously mutually beneficial for both the developer and the field worker, because the field worker now has a sense of where is all this data that I'm collecting going, and the developer has a sense of they have the trust from the field worker, but they also have a sense of the data that is being collected is fair, it's reliable, it's trustworthy, it's high quality. And also can answer all these crucial questions about where should the model be deployed, what metrics should be used, and so on. So simply having conversations, open-ended or following more formal techniques, I think anything would be helpful in this nature to establish first-hand contact and not rely on narratives from heads of organizations, which can be often limiting, because organizations have their own agendas and their own goals to meet. Probably biased as well.
Okay, let's probably take one final question from Herman.
Can I go over there?
Yeah, you can just speak.
Oh, yeah. Hi, thank you for the talk. But I really like that you emphasize the importance of doing participatory research and not doing extractive research, and doing more reducing top-down fairness. And you also mentioned the value of amplifying the expertise of the field workers. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go on.
And then I'm curious, what are the challenges when using participatory design in developing AI-based tools, given that participatory design is something that was developed in the West, and then what happened if we take that to the global South? Is there any issues or any concern based on your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's actually been a lot of pretty substantial research on how participatory design is actually, I mean, it comes from Scandinavia originally, on how the technique is not exactly equitable for the communities as well as the researchers. I think we've seen this research from both the global South as well as from Black communities with whom participatory design was conducted in the US. I think first off, it's really important to understand, and I've been through my own personal journey through this myself, being an ICTD researcher, in that there is always an inherent, or you're starting off with an inherent power imbalance, right? As a highly educated, privileged researcher or practitioner going into a vulnerable community who are, where members are taking time off their daily labor, or where every hour counts for them, right, in terms of wages and well-being. So there is that inherent power difference. And to be honest, I'm not sure if there is a way to close that gap in a meaningful way, right, where we can actually say this was a fair partnership for everybody involved, for all the stakeholders. But there are definitely ways to, first, just starting with that mindset and being aware of the fact that you want to bridge that power difference to whatever extent possible by going and visiting the communities, creating a strong relationship, helping them, reducing the opacity of these AI systems to the communities, and helping them understand what this is being done for. And really, I think it's reframing the question of how should we build AI for this problem to, let me start with understanding the context and the problem, and then figuring out what's the right approach. And maybe AI, it may not be AI, when one should be open to that, right? And that's the humility that's required of researchers that do this kind of work. And often the answer is no for any sort of intervention, right? You go in with an original assumption, and then that could just be broken. But that humility is really important, to be open, and it even requires vulnerability on part of the researcher to do that. And it's also important to preserve a relationship throughout the system building, so it's not just at the beginning stage, and then not like parachuting and then disappearing to then write an academic paper and then celebrate all the wins that come from that relationship, whereas the community continues to be in these exploitative, extractive conditions, perhaps even doing work for the AI system while the researcher is having the benefit of that system. It's really important to preserve the relationship throughout the life cycle. And I think this may be a strong point, but one also has to recognize that maybe what's required is more than AI, and it's a personal question, it's a subjective question, right? AI may not be meaningful to this community at all, right? In the sense that if farmers are contributing their data collection towards building an AI model for crop yield prediction, maybe they will never see the benefits of that model, even though it is intended to be targeted towards them. And so understanding what is actually meaningful for them, even if the system is well intended in that direction, I think that's important. It may involve non-technical things, right? Even in some cases, it may involve like building personal relationships, or like computer literacy, or like technical literacy, or other things that one might be able to provide as a researcher. I think this is a highly subjective question, though, because there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this. But there are a number of different approaches, the criticisms as well as reflections on what has worked in terms of participatory design in working with under-resourced communities in the field of HCI, ICTD, and much more. Participatory design is its own field as well. There is a whole conference which has proceedings on this.
Thank you. That was a great answer.
All right, in the interest of time, I would like to conclude the section here. So let's unmute ourselves and use your virtual hand to thank Nithya again. And yeah, I would encourage you to keep following Nithya's work to understand more about how we should deal with the data edits that made me think a lot about it. Yeah, so thank you again, and I will see you guys next Circus seminar.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, Nithya. Really appreciate a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.